A security guard tried to remove an elderly woman from an upscale mall, judging her by her appearance, until a towering figure stepped through the entrance. The whispers stopped. The crowd froze. Nobody realized who had just walked in, because this wasn't just any man. This was Shaquille O'Neal, and this was his mall. What happened next? No one saw it coming. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun hung high over the city skyline, its golden rays gleaming against the glass walls of Grand Crest Mall, a sanctuary of wealth and exclusivity. Inside, the air was crisp, laced with the subtle fragrance of designer perfumes. The floors, polished to a mirror-like sheen, reflected the towering shelves of luxury brands, Prada, Gucci, Chanel, all perfectly arranged to cater to the elite. Through the grand entrance, Margaret O'Neal walked in, her steps measured yet filled with an unshakable grace. Her navy blue dress, simple but elegant, flowed effortlessly as she moved. She didn't drape herself in diamonds or expensive bags, but there was a quiet dignity in her posture, one that told stories of struggles, resilience, and an unwavering sense of self. Shoppers around her barely noticed at first. They were too busy admiring themselves in boutique mirrors, sipping lattes from overpriced cafes, or glancing at their phones. But the moment she stepped towards an upscale jewelry store, the air shifted. A lingering gaze from a cashier. A slight hesitation in the greeter's voice. A whispered exchange between two young women, their eyes flicking in her direction before looking away. Margaret had seen it all before. She let out a small sigh and walked into Beaumont Jewelers, a store renowned for its exclusive clientele. The lighting inside was warm, casting a soft glow over rows of velvet-lined cases, each showcasing meticulously crafted rings, bracelets, and necklaces adorned with rare gems. Margaret's fingers lightly traced over a delicate gold locket, her eyes softening. A memory flickered. Shaquille, no older than 10, saving up coins in a coffee can, determined to buy her a bracelet for her birthday. She had refused the gift back then, telling him that his love was all she needed. "Ma'am, can I help you?" The voice was clipped, almost reluctant. Margaret turned to face the salesperson, a young woman with perfectly straightened blonde hair and an air of impatience. Her name tag read Jessica, and the tight smile on her face did little to mask her skepticism. "I was just admiring this piece," Margaret said, her voice smooth, unbothered. Jessica's eyes flickered to the locket, then back to Margaret, scanning her from head to toe as if doing a mental calculation of affordability. "That one's handcrafted, 18-karat gold. It's quite expensive." Margaret arched a brow. "I'm sure it is." Jessica hesitated, her fingers twitching near the case key, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, she forced another tight smile. "Perhaps something from our silver collection might be more—" The shrill voice of another shopper interrupted. "Excuse me. I need assistance with this ring." Jessica's shoulders relaxed as if relieved, and she turned away without another word, leaving Margaret standing alone by the display case. Margaret exhaled softly, shaking her head. She had been here before, not in this store, not in this mall, but in these moments. The moments where assumptions spoke louder than words. She turned and exited the store, her presence leaving no trace, no acknowledgement. Outside, the mall bustled on, indifferent. A couple walked past, their arms full of designer bags. A young girl clicked a selfie near the fountain, adjusting the filter to make herself glow. Two teenage boys debated which sneaker drop was worth their money. Margaret moved past them, heading toward the luxury handbag boutique, where a limited edition handbag had caught her eye. She rarely indulged, but today, she wanted something for herself. As she stepped inside, the security guard at the entrance, a tall man with a stern face, stiffened. His name tag read Cooper, and his hand instinctively rested near his radio. Margaret felt it before she even heard it, the weight of an unwelcome presence. She kept walking, pretending not to notice. The cashier at the counter, a young man with sleeked back brown hair, gave her a quick once-over, then turned his attention to a woman dressed in a sharp black blazer and heels, offering her a warm, rehearsed greeting. Margaret ignored it. She wasn't here for their approval. She ran her fingers over the soft Italian leather of the handbag, appreciating the craftsmanship. It was a deep shade of burgundy, understated but elegant, exactly her style. You know, that's one of our most expensive pieces. The words came from a different voice this time, male, clipped with something almost amused. Margaret glanced up to see Cooper, the security guard, standing just a few feet away. His gaze wasn't hostile, but it held that familiar, questioning look. A look that said, "Are you lost? Do you belong here?" Margaret tilted her head slightly. "Is that so?" Cooper nodded slowly, adjusting his stance. "Yeah, runs for about $6,000. Real calfskin. Limited stock." Margaret let out a soft hum. "That's good to know." She reached for the price tag, flipping it over with ease. 6,000, just as he'd said. The number didn't faze her, but Cooper wasn't watching the bag. He was watching her reaction. And when her expression didn't change, something in his jaw tightened. "Are you looking for something in particular?" he asked. The politeness was forced, like he was trying to make his suspicion sound professional. Margaret met his gaze, unwavering. "Just browsing." "Right." He nodded, but didn't step away. Margaret's fingers rested on the bag for a moment longer before she let it go, turning toward the exit. She could feel his eyes following her as she walked out. A quiet anger settled in her chest, but she pushed it down. She had learned long ago, some battles weren't worth the fight. Outside, the mall remained the same, a world that moved for some and stood still for others. Margaret exhaled and pulled out her phone, her fingers hovering over a familiar contact name, Shaquille. She hesitated. She didn't want to bother him, didn't want to be the reason he had to fight another battle. Instead, she slipped her phone back into her bag. And then, just as she was about to leave, a sharp voice echoed from behind. "Ma'am, I'm gonna have to ask you a few questions." She turned back slowly. Cooper was now standing with another security officer. The air shifted. The murmurs around her grew. Margaret's heart didn't race. Her hands didn't shake. She simply lifted her chin, knowing exactly what this was, and what was about to unfold. Margaret O'Neill adjusted the strap of her purse as she moved toward the boutique's main display, where the latest collection of luxury handbags sat perched on glass pedestals. The store was pristine, almost clinical in its presentation. Every item arranged with meticulous precision, every price tag carrying a number that most people wouldn't dare glance at twice. She had always appreciated good craftsmanship. She ran her fingers along the smooth leather of a deep burgundy tote, admiring the intricate stitching and the subtle gold logo embedded at its base. It wasn't about the price. It was about the quality, the work that went into making something timeless. Across the boutique, Cooper, the mall's lead security officer, leaned against a pillar near the entrance, watching. He had been stationed here long enough to recognize who belonged and who didn't. At least that's what he told himself. His job was simple: maintain order, prevent theft, and ensure the clientele felt safe. But his version of safe had a pattern, one that only applied to certain people. And Margaret O'Neill had set off his internal alarms the moment she stepped in. His eyes narrowed as she picked up the bag, turning it in her hands with a calm, measured appreciation. He had seen this before. Someone lingering too long, touching things they had no intention of buying. He tapped the small earpiece in his right ear. "Got a possible case in Lux leather, keeping an eye on it." A voice crackled back. "Need backup?" "Not yet." Margaret continued her slow inspection of the bag, oblivious to the silent scrutiny. She glanced toward the cashier's counter, where a neatly dressed young man stood, his name tag reading, David. Their eyes met for the briefest second. David hesitated. His trained smile faltered before returning, tighter this time. He didn't step forward, didn't offer a greeting. Instead, his gaze flickered toward the store's assistant manager, a woman with dark brown hair tied into a sleek bun. She stood by a display near the fitting rooms, watching the interaction unfold with passive curiosity. Margaret noticed. She noticed the hesitation, the silent exchange. She noticed the way David's hands fidgeted, as if unsure whether to assist or pretend he hadn't seen her. She sighed, setting the handbag back on the pedestal with deliberate gentleness. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. The moment her fingertips left the bag, Cooper moved. His stride was measured, confident, but there was a weight to his steps, a deliberate attempt to establish control before a single word was spoken. Margaret turned just as he approached, her expression calm but unreadable. "Ma'am," Cooper said, his voice flat, professional. "Everything all right?" A simple question, but the meaning behind it was louder than the words themselves. Margaret held his gaze, unfazed. "Yes. Why wouldn't it be?" Cooper's lips pressed into a thin line. "Just making sure. We get misunderstandings sometimes." Margaret tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Misunderstandings?" David at the counter suddenly busied himself with a register receipt, pretending not to hear. The assistant manager at the back shifted her weight, arms crossing as she observed from a distance. A couple of nearby shoppers glanced over, their interest piqued by the security guard's presence. Cooper exhaled sharply through his nose, as if debating whether to push forward or walk away. But something about the way she stood so still, so calm, irked him. "I noticed you were looking at the bags for a while," he said, voice firm now. "Just wanted to check if you needed assistance." Margaret gave him a slow nod, but there was a flicker of something knowing in her eyes. "If I needed assistance, I would have asked the gentleman at the register." Cooper's jaw tensed. The tension in the air thickened, stretching like an invisible rope being pulled from both ends. More shoppers were paying attention now, a man flipping through his wallet near the counter, a woman holding an iced coffee near the entrance, a pair of teenagers whispering near the sunglasses display. Margaret had been through enough in her lifetime to recognize when a scene was forming, and she had spent years learning how to pick her battles. So, she let out a small, measured breath and stepped past Cooper, walking toward the exit with the same quiet grace she had entered with. But Cooper wasn't done. His fingers twitched near his radio as he turned slightly, angling his body to block her direct path. "Ma'am, I'll need you to wait a moment." Margaret stopped. Slowly, she turned back, raising a brow. "Excuse me?" Cooper straightened his posture. "I just need to confirm a few things." Margaret glanced around. The boutique was completely silent now, the hum of casual shopping replaced with the weight of expectation. She had seen this play out before, had lived it in grocery stores, department stores, parking lots. The assumption, the suspicion, the unspoken accusation. But here's what Cooper didn't know. He didn't know that she had raised a boy who grew into one of the most powerful men in the country. Didn't know that the very ground he was standing on, the marble floors, the luxury storefronts, the very walls of this mall, belonged to her son. And that son had taught her long ago that silence was not always submission. So Margaret didn't shrink, didn't stumble over an apology she didn't owe. Instead, she locked eyes with Cooper, her gaze steady, unflinching. "Confirm what exactly?" she asked, her voice smooth as silk, sharp as glass. Cooper hesitated, just for a second, but the damage was already done. People were watching. A woman near the perfume counter whispered to her friend. A middle-aged man adjusted his blazer, suddenly uncomfortable. A teenager raised his phone slightly, pretending to scroll but definitely recording. The moment stretched. And then, in that silence, a new voice cut through. "Is there a problem here?" The boutique's general manager had arrived. A woman in her late 50s, dressed in a perfectly pressed black blazer, her tone carefully neutral. But there was a flicker of panic in her gaze. She had just walked into something dangerous. Cooper, sensing the shift in power, cleared his throat and took a step back. "No problem at all, ma'am." Margaret didn't move, didn't break eye contact. Not yet. The manager forced a strained smile, glancing between them. "Mrs. O'Neill, is there anything I can assist you with today?" And just like that, the power shifted. Not because they suddenly recognized who she was, but because they realized they had made a mistake. Margaret let the moment linger before finally offering a slow, measured smile. "No," she said gently. "I was just about to leave." She stepped around Cooper. This time he didn't move to stop her. The weight of the moment hung in the air long after she walked out. And as she disappeared into the main concourse of the mall, One thought circled through Cooper's mind. Who the hell was that woman? But he was about to find out. Because in just a few minutes, his radio would crackle again. And the voice on the other end would tell him something that would make his stomach drop. Something that would make him wish, more than anything, that he had walked away when he had the chance. Margaret O'Neill had been in uncomfortable situations before. She had spent her life navigating the thin, sharp edges of judgment, where people didn't say what they were thinking, but their eyes told the story anyway. She had long since learned to carry herself with quiet dignity, knowing that sometimes that was the only armor a person could have. But this moment, this, was different. Cooper, the security guard, had taken one step too close, his stance rigid with the certainty of authority. His hand hovered near his belt, where a radio and a keyring jingled with the faintest movement. Margaret stood her ground, her expression controlled, though the weight of a dozen silent stares pressed against her. "Ma'am," Cooper said again, this time sharper, "I need to see some ID." Margaret blinked once, slowly. "Excuse me?" Cooper exhaled, as if her confusion was an inconvenience, as if she should already understand the rules she had apparently broken. "I need identification." The boutique wasn't large, but in the thick silence, it felt cavernous. The shelves of expensive handbags, the velvet-lined displays, the glimmer of gold and leather, it all shrunk into the background, fading against the tension pooling between them. David, the store clerk, had stilled behind the counter, his fingers curling around the edge of the register, as if bracing for impact. The assistant manager shifted uncomfortably near a mirrored display, eyes flicking between Margaret and Cooper. And then came the whispers. A woman near the perfume counter leaned toward her friend. "Maybe she's lost?" A teenage girl holding a shopping bag smirked. "Probably can't afford anything here." Margaret heard them. Every word, every murmur. She lifted her chin, her back straightening like steel had replaced her spine. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice even, smooth. Cooper tilted his head, a small, knowing smirk twitching at the corner of his mouth. "You tell me, ma'am. You've been in here a while, looking at expensive merchandise, not asking for help, just lingering." Margaret let the words settle between them. Lingering. The way he said it, the way he weighed it with suspicion, as if she had somehow broken an unspoken rule. She had seen other women glide through this store with ease, flipping through scarves, holding up handbags, laughing as they tossed expensive perfumes into their shopping carts without a second glance from security. But her, she was being monitored, questioned, cornered, and now, publicly, she was being demanded to prove that she belonged here. "I wasn't aware ID was required to shop," she said finally, her voice calm, though a flicker of something sharp lurked beneath it. Cooper let out a short, amused breath, shaking his head slightly. "It's not." Margaret's brow lifted. "Then why are you asking?" A few people had stopped pretending to browse, their attention now fully locked onto the unfolding tension. Cooper shifted his stance, glancing around as if finally realizing that people were watching. Phones were coming out. Someone had started recording, but instead of stepping back, he doubled down. "It's just a standard security check," he said, his voice taking on a patronizing edge. "To prevent any, incidents." Margaret exhaled slowly. "And what kind of incident do you think I'm about to cause?" Cooper didn't answer, because he couldn't say it outright. Couldn't say what was glaring between the lines of this interaction. Instead, he took one last step closer, his voice dropping just slightly. "I need you to leave the store." The words hit harder than they should have, even though Margaret had expected them. It wasn't just an order. It was a statement, a decision already made about her, about who he thought she was. A hush rippled through the store. The people recording held their breaths, waiting. Margaret felt something tighten in her chest, but she refused to let it show. "I'm not leaving." A challenge. A line drawn. Cooper's jaw ticked. And then, without hesitation, he reached forward and grabbed her arm. It wasn't violent. Not quite. But it was firm. Possessive. Final. And it was a mistake. A sharp gasp broke through the crowd, someone muttering, "Oh, hell no." Margaret stiffened, a sharp breath catching in her throat. The humiliation burned, hot, deep, cutting through the years of patience she had learned to master. She jerked her arm back, just enough to break his hold, just enough to put space between them. Her voice came out low, raw. "You don't understand who I am." It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't a threat. It was the truth, laced with decades of battles fought in silence. But Cooper? Cooper laughed, a mocking, disbelieving scoff, his grip tightening around his radio. "Lady, I know exactly who you are." And that's when the doors opened. That's when the murmurs in the boutique shifted into a new kind of whisper. That's when a shadow stretched across the marble floor, long, unmistakable. Because standing at the entrance of the boutique was Shaquille O'Neal. And he had heard every word. The conference room inside the O'Neal Enterprises headquarters was a fortress of power and precision. The polished mahogany table stretched across the room, seating a dozen of the company's top executives, their designer suits crisp, their voices smooth with the confidence that came with money and influence. Shaquille O'Neal sat at the head of the table, leaning back in his chair, his massive frame making the executive seat look like a child's toy. His presence was commanding, even when he wasn't speaking. The conversation around him was sharp and strategic. A multi-million-dollar deal with a major sports brand was on the table, and everyone knew his endorsement alone could shift the industry's market overnight. But Shaq wasn't in a hurry. He had learned over the years that power wasn't in rushing. It was in knowing when to move and when to wait. A sleek corporate phone buzzed on the table. Not his usual work line, his private number, the one only a handful of people had access to. Shaq's eyes flicked down to the screen, and something in his posture changed. The name flashing across the screen wasn't one he had expected. Michael, one of the senior managers at Grand Crest Mall. A place Shaq owned. A place his mother often visited. He answered with a slow, steady voice. "Talk to me." On the other end, Michael's voice was tight, urgent, slightly nervous. "Sir, I wasn't sure if I should call, but..." He hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "It's your mother. There's a situation at the mall." The words landed like a hammer against stone. The air in the room shifted. The voices around the table blurred into nothing. Shaq stared at the wall ahead of him, unmoving, every muscle in his body going still. Too still. "What situation?" His voice was low, controlled. Michael swallowed. "Security stopped her, accused her of..." He hesitated, as if the words were too ridiculous to say aloud. "Let's just say they don't know who she is. It's getting... ugly." Shaq didn't react, didn't speak, didn't move. But inside something ancient and thunderous cracked open. There were moments in life that built a man, and moments that reminded him exactly who he was. Flash. Margaret O'Neal, standing in a tiny kitchen, counting the last few dollars in her purse, deciding between groceries or rent. Flash. Shaq, 11 years old, walking home from school, hearing the whispers, "Too big, too different, doesn't belong." Flash. His mother's voice steady, unshaken. "Never let them tell you who you are, baby. You show them." The storm inside him roared. But on the outside, he was silent. He pushed back his chair and stood. The room froze. The executive stared, confused, waiting for an explanation. His assistant, a sharp-dressed man in his 40s, tilted his head slightly. "Sir? Everything all right?" Shaq grabbed his coat, slid his phone into his pocket. "Where are you going?" Shaq paused, his massive frame casting a shadow over the boardroom table. His voice was quiet, steady, absolute. "Home." And then, he walked out. The engine of the black Escalade rumbled low as it sliced through traffic, moving like a panther in the night. Shaq sat in the back seat, his jaw tight, fingers steepled together, his eyes fixed on nothing. His driver, Elliot, a former military man, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Straight to the mall, boss?" Shaq gave a small nod. "Fast." Elliot didn't ask questions. Didn't need to. The way Shaq's hands clenched, the way his chest rose and fell slower than usual, the way his silence filled the car like an impending thunderstorm. It was enough. Shaq's phone buzzed again, a text from Michael. "Sir, it's escalating." His mother's face flashed in his mind. The thought of her standing there, being questioned, being humiliated. His fingers curled into a fist. The memory came uninvited, hitting him in waves. A small apartment, years ago. A young Shaquille, barely a teenager, sitting at the dinner table, his fists clenched. His mother standing in front of him, arms crossed. What happened? He had been pushed at school, called names, laughed at for being too big. He had wanted to fight back, but she had stopped him. Not because she wanted him to be weak, but because she wanted him to be stronger than them in a way they'd never expect. "You don't win by hitting first, baby." Shaq had frowned. "Then how do you win?" His mother had leaned in, pressing a hand against his massive chest. "You win by making them wish they had treated you differently." Shaq inhaled slowly, pulling himself back to the present. The mall came into view. Bright, towering. His name was on the deed. His legacy was in the foundation. And right now, inside that building, someone was about to learn exactly who they had just messed with. The Escalade slowed at the entrance, but Shaq didn't wait for it to stop completely. He opened the door and stepped out, his 7 feet 1 inch frame casting a shadow against the pavement. The people near the entrance froze, their eyes widening. A murmur rippled through the air. He didn't hear them, didn't need to. His focus was locked. He walked into the mall, the air shifting around him. Inside, near the boutique, a small crowd had gathered. Phones were up, whispers were spreading. And at the center of it all, his mother, and the man standing too close to her. Shaq's eyes darkened. The storm had arrived. The air inside Grand Crest Mall was thick with tension. The boutique, usually a quiet space filled with the hum of credit card swipes and soft conversations, had turned into something entirely different. People stood frozen, their gazes locked onto the center of the commotion, a confrontation that had started as a whisper, but had now swelled into something bigger, heavier. Margaret O'Neill stood in the middle of it all, her face calm, her back straight, her presence unshaken despite the weight of the eyes on her. Cooper, the security guard, had made up his mind. His grip on his radio was tight, his stance unmovable. He had crossed the threshold from suspicious authority to absolute enforcer, and now there was no turning back. The murmurs grew. A woman near the perfume display whispered to her friend, "Is she being arrested?" A man in a tailored suit frowned. "What's even happening?" One of the store clerks, nervous and unsure, glanced toward the assistant manager, as if silently asking, "Should we stop this?" But nobody moved. Nobody spoke up. And then, Cooper made his move. "All right, ma'am," he said, his voice clipped, final. "You need to leave. Now." Margaret didn't move, didn't blink. "I'm not going anywhere." Cooper's jaw tightened. He reached out, fingers brushing against her arm, the start of something worse. And then, it happened. A shift. A presence. Something changed in the air. Something heavy, unseen but deeply felt, like the distant roll of thunder before a storm breaks open the sky. At the entrance of the boutique, a shadow stretched long across the polished marble floor, stretching further and further until someone looked up, and their breath caught. A massive figure stepped inside the boutique, his frame blocking the bright lights of the main concourse behind him. For a second, nobody registered who he was. They just saw a man, towering, unshakable, moving with quiet, lethal precision. The murmurs stopped. The crowd's energy shifted. Even the assistant manager, who had been half hoping this whole mess would resolve itself, took a half step back, instinctively sensing something was about to happen. Cooper didn't see him at first. Didn't notice the way the air changed, the way people stopped mid-sentence, mid-movement, their focus snapping towards something behind him. No, Cooper was too busy, too focused on finishing what he started. "Ma'am, this is my final warning." Then, something shifted in the crowd, a presence, a motion. Cooper turned, annoyed, ready to send whoever it was away. And that's when he saw him. Shaquille O'Neal, 7 feet 1 inch, built like a legend carved out of stone. A man whose name carried the weight of champions, of empires, of legacy. For one fleeting second, Cooper's brain struggled to process the reality before him. But reality was standing right there, staring straight at him. His eyes were dark, unreadable, locked not on Cooper but on Margaret, his mother. And he was still walking. Not rushed, not frantic, but with the slow, deliberate certainty of a man who had already decided exactly how this was going to end. Cooper's instinct kicked in before logic did. "Sir, stay back," he snapped, his grip on his radio tightening. "This doesn't concern you." Shaq didn't even slow down, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge the command. He just kept walking. Every step swallowed the space between them, every second stretching unbearably as the reality of the moment started sinking into everyone watching. This wasn't just a large man walking into a tense situation. This was Shaquille O'Neal, and they had no idea what was about to happen next. Cooper finally registered the size of him, the sheer presence of him, the way the boutique, hell, the entire mall, seemed to shrink in his wake. And yet, despite that, despite everything, the training, the protocols, the dozens of eyes watching this unfold, Cooper made one last mistake. He stood his ground. "Sir, I need you to step back, now." Shaq stopped walking. He was now only inches away, his shadow stretching over Cooper, his mother, the polished floors, the handbags, the whole moment itself. The silence was so absolute that the faint hum of the mall's overhead speakers was the only sound left. Shaq's voice was low, even controlled. "You just put your hands on the wrong woman." Cooper's stomach dropped. It was then, only then, that the full weight of his mistake hit him. The customers watching knew it before he did. The assistant manager, who had been frozen in place, finally realized why something had felt so dangerously off about all of this. Even the store clerks, who had been watching with half-interest before, now stood as still as statues, holding their breath. Someone muttered under their breath, "Oh, this just got serious." A customer near the boutique entrance whispered, "Dude, that's Shaq." And suddenly the name started to ripple through the crowd. Shaq, Shaquille O'Neal. And just like that, Cooper's entire body language shifted. His stance, once firm and unyielding, faltered. His fingers twitched against his radio, but he didn't press the button. Because what was he going to say? What could he possibly say? That he had tried to physically remove Shaquille O'Neal's mother from a mall that he owned? He didn't know. But the look on Shaq's face, the unreadable, dead calm expression, that told him everything. Shaq wasn't here to argue, wasn't here to debate. He was here because Cooper had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And now he had to face the consequences. The moment stretched, held, unbreakable. And then, finally, Shaq spoke again, his voice like distant thunder rolling over the horizon. "Let go of my mother." Now, and this time, Cooper didn't hesitate, didn't argue, didn't fight. His fingers uncurled, his hand falling away from Margaret's arm as if he had just touched a live wire. Margaret stepped back, her face calm but unreadable. Shaq's gaze never wavered, didn't blink, didn't break. Because now, it was time to end this. And Cooper had no idea what was coming next. The silence inside Grand Crest Mall was suffocating. The kind that didn't just fill a space, it pressed down on it. The kind that made people hold their breath without realizing it. Margaret O'Neal stood at the center of it all, her posture unbroken, her dignity untouched. But there was something in her eyes. Something deeper than embarrassment. Something only a mother could feel when she was being judged for simply existing in a place where people assumed she didn't belong. And standing just feet away from her was Shaquille O'Neal. The crowd saw the size of him first, a man whose very presence shifted the energy in the room. He moved with a calm, lethal certainty, like a storm rolling in slow, unshakable, inescapable. Cooper, the security guard, had spent his entire career reading people, knowing exactly when to push and when to back off. But right now he had no idea who he had just picked a fight with, and that made him dangerous in the worst way. He felt the weight of Shaq's unblinking stare, but instead of stepping aside, his own pride kicked in. "Sir, I need you to stay back." Shaq didn't even acknowledge the words, didn't hesitate, didn't slow, didn't even flinch. He simply stepped past Cooper like he was nothing more than a shadow in his way. For the first time in his life, Cooper felt small. The crowd was still watching, phones up, whispers growing. And then, it happened. Margaret saw him, saw her son. And for the first time since this entire nightmare started, her composure cracked. Not in fear, not in relief, but in something unspoken, something deeper, because she knew her son. She knew that nothing in this world could stop him once a line had been crossed. And this wasn't just a line. This was a mistake that Cooper was about to regret for the rest of his life. Shaq finally stopped moving, directly in front of his mother. His back faced Cooper, and for one agonizing second, he didn't say anything. Just stood there, still, unshaken, like he was giving the universe one last chance to fix this before he did. Cooper shifted uneasily, confused by the lack of reaction. Didn't this guy hear him? He opened his mouth to say something, to demand control back. But before he could, Shaq turned, slow, deliberate. His eyes locked onto Cooper, and in a voice so calm it was terrifying, he said, "You just put your hands on the wrong woman." The entire mall went silent, not just the boutique, not just the people watching. The entire mall. Because those words held weight. They weren't just a statement. They weren't just a threat. They were a promise. Cooper's confidence, the arrogance, the certainty in his authority, all of it cracked. Something inside him screamed to back down. But before his brain could catch up to his mistake, someone else did. From the far end of the boutique, a manager came running. Not walking, not rushing, running. Panic etched into every sharp movement. And before Cooper could even process what was happening, the manager, a man in his mid-50s, suit crisp, sweat forming at his brow, grabbed him by the arm and yanked him back. "You idiot!" the manager hissed, voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough that the entire front row of customers heard it. Cooper stiffened, confused. "What?" The manager's face went pale, eyes darting between Shaq and Margaret. And then, leaning in just enough that only Cooper could hear, he delivered the final blow. "That's Shaquille O'Neal." A beat of silence. "What?" "Shaquille O'Neal." The manager's voice wasn't just panicked now, it was near hysterical. "He owns this place." The color drained from Cooper's face. His lips parted, his breath faltered, and for the first time since this whole situation started, he felt real fear. Not the kind of fear that came from a fight. Not the kind of fear that came from getting yelled at. But the kind of fear that came from realizing you had just ruined your entire career in the span of 30 seconds. He turned slowly, looking up at Shaq. And now, it all made sense. The reaction from the crowd, the shift in the air, the dead silence in the mall. This wasn't just a big guy coming to pick a fight. This was a man who could end him with a single word, and Cooper had just disrespected his mother. In a mall that he owned. And now there was no escape. The crowd knew it. The manager knew it. Shaq knew it. And most painfully of all, Cooper knew it. And he knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the next few minutes would decide his entire future. He had never prayed for a second chance before. But right now, he was begging the universe for one. And he had no idea if he was going to get it. The weight of silence inside the boutique was suffocating. The crowd stood frozen, their attention locked on the towering figure of Shaquille O'Neal and the ashen face of Cooper. Moments ago, Cooper had been in control, authority in his voice, confidence in his stance. Now he was barely holding himself together. His throat was dry. His hands, which had once gripped his radio with absolute certainty, now twitched at his sides. His mind raced for an explanation, for an excuse, for an escape. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Then finally a stammer, a weak, cracked voice. I didn't know." His breath hitched. "I was just doing my job." Shaq didn't move. didn't blink, didn't even tilt his head. He just stood there, a mountain of silence, a force of gravity that pulled every ounce of Cooper's fear to the surface. And then, in a voice so low, so steady it sent chills up the spines of everyone listening, Shaq said, "Your job." A pause, a moment that stretched too long. Then, "You mean judging people by their skin?" The words cut through the boutique like a blade, sharp and merciless. Cooper sucked in a breath, his eyes darting to the growing crowd outside the store, to the cell phones still recording, to the sea of strangers whose faces had now twisted from passive interest to open disgust. He had been exposed, and the people who had once stood silent, they weren't silent anymore. A man near the perfume counter, arms crossed, shook his head. "Damn shame. You really thought she didn't belong here?" A woman in a tan coat scoffed. "This is the kind of stuff we always hear about. Never thought I'd see it happen in real time." A younger girl, probably no older than 20, whispered to her friend. He put his hands on Shaq's mother. "That's crazy." The murmurs turned to voices, the voices turned to anger. And the weight of everything Cooper had done came crashing down on him all at once. His face burned. He opened his mouth again, desperate now, words spilling out faster than his brain could even process them. "I swear, I didn't mean, I just..." "Enough." Shaq's voice wasn't loud, but it stopped the air from moving. Cooper's body locked in place, as if Shaq's presence alone had rooted him to the floor. Then, another shift in the energy. From the far side of the store, a second figure appeared. The mall's general manager, an older man in his early 60s, dressed in an expensive navy suit, sweating bullets, his expression somewhere between horrified and panicked. He had just seen the footage. He had just realized exactly how badly this situation had spiraled. And now he was scrambling to fix it before it was too late. "Mr. O'Neill," he started, voice shaking. I sincerely apologize for what's happened here today. This is absolutely unacceptable." Shaq's gaze flicked toward him, just for a second. It was enough to make the man flinch. But Shaq didn't respond, didn't acknowledge the apology, didn't even move. Because an apology meant nothing if nothing changed. And Shaq wasn't here for words, he was here for accountability. The manager cleared his throat, sensing the tension hadn't lifted, so he turned to Cooper. His eyes, once full of power, full of authority, were now filled with pure disappointment. "You're done." Cooper staggered back. What? "You're fired." The manager's voice was sharp, quick, decisive, effective immediately. Cooper's entire body went rigid. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, like he might throw one final desperate defense out into the open. But as he looked around, at the disgusted faces, at the cell phones still recording, at the looming shadow of Shaq standing just inches away from him, he knew there was nothing left to say. The world had already made its judgment, and he had lost. His shoulders slumped, his fingers twitched, his eyes darted toward the exit. And then, without another word, he walked out. But Shaq? Shaq wasn't done yet. The manager, still visibly shaken, turned back to Shaq, forcing a tight, nervous smile. "Again, Mr. O'Neill, Shaq raised a hand. The manager shut up immediately. For the first time since he arrived, Shaq took a slow breath. Then, he looked at his mother. Really looked at her. And what he saw, it broke something in him. Because she wasn't angry. She wasn't shaken. She was just tired. Tired of proving herself. Tired of standing in places she had every right to be, only to be told she didn't belong. And that was unacceptable. So Shaq turned, not to the manager, but to the crowd, to the people still standing there, still watching. Because they were the ones who needed to hear this. "This isn't about one man," Shaq said, voice steady, controlled. "It's about a system." Nobody moved, nobody even breathed. Because every word he spoke carried the weight of something bigger than this moment. We like to pretend this doesn't happen anymore, but it does, every day, in ways that are loud, in ways that are quiet. He exhaled. Then, he turned back to the manager. "And if you want me to keep my investment in this mall, things are going to change." The manager's face twitched. Shaq let the words hang in the air for just a moment longer before delivering the final blow. Starting with bias training for every single employee. The manager nodded so fast his glasses nearly fell off. Yes, absolutely, Mr. O'Neill. Consider it done. Shaq stared at him for a long, heavy second. Then, finally, he nodded. And just like that, it was over. Margaret, still silent, reached for her son's hand. Shaq took it without hesitation, and together, they walked out of the boutique, past the stairs, past the murmurs, past the people who had witnessed something they would never forget. Because this wasn't just about today. This was about every day that had come before it. And the world was watching. The air inside Grand Crest Mall still crackled with tension. Even though Cooper had walked out, even though the general manager had stammered through apologies, the weight of what had just happened still hung thick in the room. People were still standing, still watching, still holding their breath. The recording phones hadn't gone down yet, because they knew something bigger was coming. And they were right. Shaquille O'Neal turned his full attention to the mall's general manager, his presence still towering, his energy still commanding. But his anger was controlled now, sharpened, not meant for destruction, but for something much bigger. The general manager, a man who had likely never been this nervous in his entire life, adjusted his tie with clammy fingers. Mr. O'Neill, he tried again, his voice thin. I assure you, Cooper's actions do not reflect the values of this establishment. He has been terminated effective immediately. Shaq studied him, his expression unreadable. Then, he did something no one expected. He shook his head. That's not enough. The manager blinked. Sir? Shaq let the moment hang, then turned, not just to the manager, but to everyone still watching. To the employees frozen behind the counter. To the shoppers clutching their bags, still trying to process what they had just seen. To his mother, who had just endured something no one should have to endure. And then, he spoke. Firing one person doesn't fix the problem. The words were calm, but they carried weight. Shaq let them settle before continuing. Because this isn't just about Cooper. He gestured toward the boutique, toward the entire mall. This is about every place like this. Every store, every restaurant, every workplace where someone like my mother walks in and is treated like she doesn't belong. The crowd shifted, not out of discomfort, but out of understanding. Because they had seen it too. They had felt it too. Shaq's voice remained steady. The truth is, if it wasn't for who I am, this would have ended differently. He exhaled. And that's the problem. The murmur in the crowd grew louder. The manager, now visibly sweating, tried to jump in. Mr. O'Neill, we deeply regret. But Shaq wasn't finished. I don't want regret. His voice was firm. I want change. The manager froze, his mouth half open, because suddenly, this conversation had taken a turn he hadn't prepared for. Shaq turned back to the crowd, his gaze settling on the employees of the boutique, the sales clerks, the assistant manager, even the ones who had stood by and watched. You don't need to be punished, Shaq said, his voice softer now but still strong. You need to be educated. That made the entire room go silent again. The manager stared at him, trying to process what was happening. Sir? Shaq turned fully to face him. I want every single employee in this mall, every worker, every manager, every security guard, to go through mandatory racial bias training. The crowd murmured. The manager stammered. I'd have to check with corporate. Shaq didn't let him finish. No. His voice was firm. If you want me to keep my investment in this mall, it starts now. The manager went pale. Because everyone in the mall knew one thing. Shaquille O'Neal didn't just shop here. He owned this place. And if he walked, the entire mall would collapse under the weight of his absence. The manager nodded so fast his glasses nearly fell off. Yes, sir. Absolutely. I'll get everything arranged immediately. Shaq stared at him a second longer, letting the moment settle. Then he nodded. And just like that, something changed. Something real. Something lasting. For once, it wasn't just an apology. It was action. And the people watching, they felt it. Which is why, when Shaq turned back to his mother, when he reached for her hand, when he gave her that silent, unspoken look of respect. The first clap started. Then another. Then another. Until the entire boutique, the entire mall lobby, erupted in applause. Not out of shock, not out of obligation, but because for once, change had actually happened, and they had witnessed it. Shaq didn't turn back, didn't wait for more praise, didn't bask in the moment. He just held his mother's hand and walked away, because at the end of the day, that was all that ever mattered. The mall felt different now, not just for Margaret O'Neill, but for everyone who had witnessed what happened that day. It wasn't just about a security guard making a mistake. It wasn't just about an apology, or a policy change, or even the fact that Shaquille O'Neal had just reshaped the way this mall would operate forever. It was about something deeper, something that couldn't be undone. And Margaret? Margaret felt it in every step she took. She wasn't rushed out. She wasn't questioned anymore. She wasn't invisible. She walked through Grand Crest Mall the way she always should have been able to, with dignity, with grace, with the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had raised a king. Shaq walked beside her, silent, steady, his presence as unmovable as ever. They didn't need to speak. Everything that needed to be said had already been spoken. They passed the boutiques, the cafes, the shoppers who had stood frozen just minutes ago. And as they moved through the corridors, something happened. Something small, something subtle, but something important. People stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some of them nodded. Some of them smiled. Some of them whispered to each other, their voices carrying phrases like, "That was powerful. I'll never forget that." That's how change happens. Margaret didn't acknowledge the whispers. She didn't need to, because for the first time in a long time, she wasn't walking in someone else's world. She was walking in her own. Shaq stopped outside an exclusive boutique, one of the most expensive in the entire mall. He gestured inside, a small smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Go crazy, Ma." Margaret chuckled, shaking her head. "I don't need anything." Shaq raised a brow. "That never stopped you before." Margaret gave him a look, the kind only a mother can give her son, the kind that made even Shaquille O'Neal straighten up just a little. "I have everything I need." And she meant it. Shaq sighed, pretending to be disappointed. "Not even a purse? Shoes? Jewelry?" Margaret looped her arm through his and patted his wrist. "I already got my gift today." Shaq exhaled through his nose, glancing around the mall, at the faces still watching, at the staff who were now questioning themselves in ways they never had before. And then, finally, he nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice softer now. "I guess we both did." They were almost at the exit when it happened. A small hand tugged at a sleeve. Not Margaret's. Shaq's. He looked down, surprised, and saw a little boy, no older than 6, bright-eyed, full of something unspoken, something powerful. His mother stood behind him, holding his other hand, watching carefully, her expression unreadable. Shaq crouched down slightly, leveling himself with the boy. "What's up, little man?" The boy didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess, didn't fumble over his words the way kids sometimes do when meeting someone famous. Instead, he pointed up at Shaq with absolute certainty and said, "Mom, that's the guy who stood up for us." The mall went silent again. But this silence was different. Margaret's breath hitched. Shaq felt something deeper than pride, deeper than victory, deeper than anything he had felt during his entire career. Because this wasn't about basketball, wasn't about championships or records or money. This question mark. This was about something that lasted longer than fame. This was legacy. The boy's mother smiled. Shaq smiled back. And then, cut to black. This isn't just a story, it's a reality too many people face every day. How many times have we seen someone treated unfairly and looked the other way? How many times have we stayed silent when we should have spoken up? Not anymore. Have you ever witnessed or experienced something like this? Share your story, let the world hear it. Tag someone who would have Shaq's back in a moment like this. Spread this message, because respect, dignity, and justice should never depend on who's watching.